So tonight we're going to talk about vocal fold closure, and one of the things I just want to kind of have you think about as we're talking about vocal fold closure is that we've already kind of talked about a lot of these different principles already in some of the different slides that we've talked about. In fact, the last week's topic on loud voice thinks, we have to think about vocal fold closure and adduction patterns so that we can make loud voice, so that we can build up that subglottal pressure or tracheal pressure in a way that then blows the vocal folds apart, increases lateralization of that vocal fold mucosal wave, and then that allows for greater intensity. So sometimes we're talking about vocal fold closure because we need to increase loudness. Other times we may talk about vocal fold closure because there may not be complete closure of the vocal folds at the laryngeal level. A lot of times when we're trying to produce loudness, we're not necessarily trying to increase loudness to an abnormal level, but for those folks who have insufficient adduction patterns or insufficient closure, just another way of saying that, then we need to actually physically get the vocal folds together to build up that pressure. One of the traps that we can fall into, and what we talked about a little bit last week when we talked about loud voice, is that although we may need to increase adduction patterns, that is, increase vocal fold closure, we don't necessarily want to equate that with hyperadduction. Now, sure, again, just like when we were talking about loud voice, if you have muscle weakness, if you have rigidity, if you have spasticity, you absolutely want to increase adduction to make the vocal folds move, right? Sometimes you might have vocal paresis. You have one vocal fold coming to midline, but you can't get that other vocal fold coming to midline. When you're trying to overcome neurologic issues, issues with weakness, and again, that rigidity spasticity piece ties into that abnormal neuromotor response, then yes, we do want to think about hyperadducting because the vocal folds are so hypo in their adduction pattern that we're not getting any type of closure. But sometimes when we have, ooh, a little glottal fry there tonight, sometimes when we're not able to close the vocal folds, when we can't adduct them, it's really not that they are not adducting correctly, it's that maybe they're not getting the maximum adduction pattern that they could be getting. So maybe they're touching, or maybe they're close to touching, and maybe they're kind of fluttering in place, but for whatever reason, they are not adducting enough to allow for an appropriate phonation threshold pressure, or as I have here on the slide, a correct PTP value. And so they're not getting this nice periodic mucosal wave. So we've got an issue now with potential loudness because we're not getting that adduction and buildup of PTP. We may have an issue with efficient vocal fold closure, and if we don't get the right type of closure, we may have periodicity issues. And that means that our periodic mucosal wave is not going to be happening. So we may not get the right pitch, and we're going to get these odd vocal qualities. So in some ways, when we talk about facilitating efficient vocal fold closure, we're talking about better ways to adduct the vocal folds. Now, this unit of exercises specifically is going to focus on better ways to adduct the vocal folds and really focus on the laryngeal level. Again, in the previous exercises, the loud exercises, we were really relying on that breath support to help provide that increase in subglottal or PTP value, right? That subglottal pressure. This set of exercises you're going to see is going to focus much more on getting the vocal folds themselves, the thyroarytenoid muscles, to do what they need to do to come to midline, okay? So there's a slight difference in our focus, even though the overall closure or adduction of the vocal folds is the same outcome. Does that make sense? So I'll just say that again. We're in both loud exercises and in facilitating efficient vocal fold closure exercises. The outcome, that is adducting the vocal folds, is the same. The difference is how we do that. So in your loud exercises, you really need to pair that breath support with decreased overall tension in the laryngeal mechanism. with these exercises that we're going to talk about tonight, of course we want to have good breath support, but that will not be the focus of most of the exercises. Instead, the focus is going to be on how we can physically get the vocal folds to move together, but to do so in a way that does not provide strain or additional hyperfunction of that closure pattern. So hopefully that makes sense, and it will continue to make sense as we continue through this lecture. Okay, and so just as I was saying there, that we want to increase overall adduction, but we do not want to increase hyperfunction. We don't want to create more tension. That's just going to cause us to have poor pitch, poor loudness, poor quality, all of those three variables that are so important that allow us to produce normal, typical vocal patterns. So some of the feedback I've been reading in your comments is that some of you aren't sure, like, how do all these things go hand in hand? How do you know when to implement this type of technique with a client versus this technique with a client? And we haven't really talked about that in a global sense because I wanted you to have all the techniques. But I also don't want you to feel like your techniques are occurring in a silo. Rarely do we do what I would call silo therapy, where I'm only doing this exercise for 60 minutes. I'm only doing this exercise for 40 minutes. That's not typically how it happens. Anyone who's treated a 3-year-old for language problems knows that you are constantly through play working on those morphosyntactic markers. You're increasing semantic content. You're working on getting those phonemes into that inventory. Maybe that's an easier example to think about as we think about kind of coordinating these different types of exercises into one type of voice therapy in a given session. So if I have a client who has low volume, they're using the wrong register, so they don't have an appropriate pitch, and they've got this weird kind of breathy but sometimes creaky vocal quality, I might find that all of the exercises that we've talked about so far, semi-occluded, resonant, loud voice, and vocal fold closure exercises, are something that I can be doing throughout my treatment. And so again, if my targets are to increase or lower pitch, increase or lower loudness, improve quality, and we can think about what are those variables of quality that we're trying to reduce. Is it a strained, strangled voice? Are we trying to get rid of that rough quality? Maybe we're decreasing breathiness. All of that's going to kind of help shape when we bring in different types of exercises, okay? So let's talk about how these all go hand in hand. When you increase breath support, you regulate intensity, pitch, and that ends up giving us better vocal quality. You could also increase breath support, though, and accidentally increase laryngeal tension. So using a semi-occluded exercise or intermingling loud voice exercises with semi-occluded exercises may actually decrease the overall tension. So as you're using more breath support and you're building up more phonation threshold pressure, intermingling those loud exercises with semi-occluded exercises will actually use that reflected wave to abduct the superior portion of the vocal folds. So now we decrease tension in the laryngeal mechanism while we are increasing breath support. You might also use resonant exercises to provide sensation. Okay, client, while you're working on your breath support, I've got a lot of things going, right? You're juggling a lot of balls in the air. I want you to increase breath support. I also want you to be thinking about the feelings that you're having in the front of your face. Are you feeling sensation in the lips? Are you feeling sensation in the nasal cavity? Are you feeling sensation in the palate? That's where you need to be feeling sensations in the oral portion of our vocal tract, not in the laryngeal mechanism. So if we're increasing resonance, we're taking tension off the larynx. If we're using semi-occluded exercises, we're using that resonant wave pattern to lightly abduct the vocal folds. That decreases tension. When we marry that with increasing breath support, now we've got good support for both regulating appropriate pitch, regulating intensity, right? And so as we start to think about including vocal fold closure activities, Now we also can increase adduction at the laryngeal level, but we can do it paired with these other activities, so we're decreasing overall laryngeal tension. So these are meant to be kind of intermingled. Some of these exercises have to happen before other ones. If you don't have good breath support, you should not be doing vocal fold closure activities because you're going to be at risk for increasing that hypertension. You'll be over-adducting at the vocal folds to do all the activities, increasing loudness, right? That's not what we want. So we need to sometimes think about starting at the foundation. Let's build our breath support and then see where your client goes. Some clients, they're going to need that sensation from a resonant voice exercise before they can do anything else once they know how to do and use diaphragmatic breathing. Some clients, they'll have so much tension, you may want to go straight to a semi-occluded exercise. See if you can decrease that tension. Once that tension's decreased, then you can start to focus on resonant exercises. So it is going to be somewhat client-specific. There isn't a cookbook approach to this, but if you have enough tools in your toolbox and you know what they do, then you can start to pair and play with them as you and your client are trying to decrease tension, increase breath support, and then figure out what the vocal folds need to be doing. Are we hypoadducting them? Are we hyperadducting them? So hopefully that provides a little bit more clarity over how we're going to be using these exercises. And there's going to be plenty of time as we move through the rest of the semester to start utilizing all of these different exercises into a treatment plan that we then apply to a client. So enough talking, Kimberly. Okay, let's get right down into it. So we have a few different exercises. One of the main ones is the vocal function exercise, and it's an entire regiment that was created to really strengthen the laryngeal muscles. And by strengthening the muscles, the idea is that then you're going to be able to improve vocal fold adduction. So you'll see here on the screen, I have an actual vocal function exercise practice record. That's in your book if you have it. And you can photocopy this and use it with your clients. You could use it with them in your session as you go through all of the different exercises. And then you could make copies of it for your client to use when they are using an at-home practice maintenance schedule. So then they can fill out all of their daily practice, what day they're doing it, what pitch they're working on, and then they can bring that into you with your next session and you can review the results with them. So this task includes a warm-up, some stretching exercises, contracting exercises, and then low impact adductory power tasks is what they're called. We're going to go ahead and take a listen. Let me see how this...
These are vocal function exercises.
Go.
Exercise number 1. Sustain the vowel E for as long as possible on the musical note F. Make it very nasal, like this. Take a deep breath. These are vocal function exercises.
Now, I'm not going to play all of those videos. Last time I noticed when I played them and I was listening back, there was a little bit of reverberation through the microphone. And so if you are watching on YouTube, you may also want to open up the PowerPoint that is also listed in Dropbox, and you can listen to those files completely. Now, those are taken from the textbook, and so you're going to get most of the protocol that's described. And I really felt like I probably couldn't do the protocol better than the person who originated it. But that's going to be the best way to get to those vocal exercises is through the PowerPoint, and then hopefully we won't have any resonance issues like we did last time. One of the things to think about when you're doing a vocal function exercise, or these series of exercises, if you will, is that you're monitoring both the pitch. Can the client, stay on pitch? Can they increase their duration of holding out that pitch? As you noticed in that one example, the gentleman was actually really increasing the duration of holding out that pitch. You also want to monitor quality. So you're looking and listening for voice breaks. Is there a change in breathiness? Either the client may start out breathy, they may kind of waver and go in between breathy and regular, or maybe they'll go from breathy to a voice break, and maybe they'll end on breathiness when they've run out of air. You would monitor when those voice breaks, breathy moments, or if there's this wavering. So a pitch waver might be right? So we've got this kind of warble. You would want to know when that's occurring. Is it happening early during the production, kind of in the middle, during the end? You might even note it very objectively using the stopwatch on your phone, right? Where you could kind of figure out where that's occurring. Now, the other thing that we want is that when people are producing the vowels in the different exercises, we want a usual or an easy phonatory attack. We don't want a hard glottal attack. Remember, that's where you adduct first, and then you build up pressure, and then you start to phonate. And we don't want a breathy glottal attack, and that's where you breathe out, and then you start to phonate. We want to have a usual or easy phonatory attack, so that's when you start voicing and breathing at the same time. And really, we don't even need to necessarily mention this to our clients because that's what we typically do anyway. If your client, however, has a strained voice, they're likely using a hard glottal attack, so you're going to want to work on that maybe prior to doing this vocal function exercise. Same way, if they have a breathy glottal attack, you're going to want to kind of work on seeing if you could deduct those vocal folds together a little bit better, maybe using some of the other exercises that we're going to discuss tonight. And then we could work on kind of holding out that adduction pattern for a little bit of time. The other thing you need to talk to your client about is that the increase in, try that again, the increase in duration that you're hearing when you prolong that vowel is secondary to the vocal fold adduction pattern, not the breath support. So your client, it's assumed that your client already has really good diaphragmatic breath support. If they don't, this is not the exercise you should be starting at. You need to start back with your diaphragmatic breathing. You might need to work up to that using some of your resonant voice treatments, and then you'd be ready for vocal function exercises. This is really kind of a more advanced, later move or extra set of exercises that you'd want to do. So your client already has great breath support. What you're trying to do is increase vocal quality, improve pitch while they're still holding out that duration. So if your client comes in and says, so they can hold it out really long, but it's still sucky for that whole time. What you're hoping to see as you move through these vocal exercises day after day after day is that you're building up the strength of the thyroarytenoid muscles, and you are then increasing the overall adduction pattern, which should improve that pitch while you're still maintaining that long duration. So hopefully the client will be going from E to E, right? Same duration, except now what we've done is we've improved the quality through the adduction pattern, okay? So there is a maintenance program. Once you've done this with your client, you know, over several, I would say probably a good week, one of the things you have to think about is that you want your client to meet 85% criterion for their peak time. So some clients, their peak time might be 17 milliseconds that they can hold out an E. Some clients, it might be 15 milliseconds. We want our clients to be able to maintain a sustained vowel in the normative range, and right, we have norms for these. So you want your client to be able to maintain this set of exercises by meeting their criterion 85% of the time. Once they can do that, then you can begin tapering them through these different taper exercises. So the first taper would be doing the full program at home 2 times each day, twice a day. I'm sorry, the full program, you would go through it twice, so all the exercises would be done twice. That would be done twice a day. Once your clients met 85% criterion for being able to do the program for that specific amount of time, then you would take them down a notch. You'd say, okay, now I want you to do the full program 2 times in a row, 1 time a day. Now you'll notice in the tapered maintenance program here that that time of day should always be morning. And if we were in class together, I would ask you, why would that be? And hopefully your thought process automatically goes to the idea that when we wake up in the morning, we really haven't been using our vocal folds at all while we've been sleeping. They should have just been in a neutral position while you were breathing, and they should be ready to go and work on this program. They shouldn't have end of the day fatigue. And this is really important to think about because a lot of times our clients are those who are heavy voice users, right? We're getting people in who use their voice all the time. So it's not ideal for them to be working on vocal fold adductions, and it's almost like a strengthening program for their thyroarytenoid muscles. We don't want them to be doing that after they've already worn down the muscles all the time. I like to think about this when you run. A lot of my friends run. I certainly don't. That's just craziness. But people who run tend to run in the morning. They don't want to be running at night all the time after they've been up all day, or if you have a manual labor job, their muscles are sore. They want to work out when they're fresh. So it's the same thing with your vocal folds. You're going to keep, again, every time you try a new tapered level, you need to meet 85% criterion of that client's duration peak time. And then eventually you want to get them down to just using exercise 4, which is the most speech-like exercise, 1 time through, once a week in the morning. Okay? Now for vocal fry, I do have a video here, and again, I apologize if you're watching on YouTube. You may want to download the PowerPoint, or I'll also try to link it. Maybe I can link it in the actual Dropbox link so that you can see what vocal fry looks like on a laryngeal when you're being scoped. Woo. So vocal fry. I'm going to bring vocal fry in right now and talk about what we think's happening and why this would be useful, because the next 2 exercises actually encourage people to stay in vocal fry. And when they're doing vocal fry, they're then going to be moving out of vocal fry, but trying to keep that really relaxed adduction pattern while they're in modal register. So during vocal fry, the vocal folds are really lax, and you can see this in the picture here. They're shortened, but they're not contracted as when we are using the thyroarytenoid to decrease pitch. They're just shortened, but they're kind of still wobbly. And we tend to see some overall increased contact between the folds, but what you'll notice in the video is that the contact is more of a flutter movement. So the vocal folds are in touch with one another, but they're not in touch in such a way that you're getting meaningful movement. And what do I mean by that? Meaningful movement for our vocal folds is an adduction pattern that produces a mucosal wave. So the fluttering movement doesn't really allow for a mucosal wave. You don't get good voicing with your glottal fry, right? Or your vocal fry. That is very different than which is also a low pitch, but it's a voiced low pitch where we have nice mucosal wave. When I do a vocal fry, because the vocal folds are very lax and kind of wobbly and they're fluttering, what that allows is for puffs of air to push through the vocal folds, and it's like these little pops of air are happening, not an actual compressed sound wave or sine wave. It's not this nice puff of air that has a very regular pattern to it. Instead, it's just kind of like fricated noise that's popping through the vocal folds, okay? So when we get this lower gravelly pitch, we've got the low pitch due to the short and thicker vocal folds. But because the vocal folds are lax, air pops through the vocal folds, and that causes that creaky, gravelly vocal quality. So again, we don't have a true mucosal wave, and that's why the quality is the way it is, okay? So we're going to try to use this lax vocal quality, and then hopefully we can take that laxness and that feeling of lack of tension, and as we increase adduction to get into a higher pitch, we allow for a better adduction pattern that isn't hyper-adducted. So that's the whole point behind this. So again, we've got our vocal fry modal exercise. We're going to use our changes in registers from vocal fry to modal to change vocal fold tension and then improve control over adduction. And this was really an exercise that was created when mass lesions were present. And the author in your book really talks about this is a great exercise to use with clients who have polyps. That feeling of a polyp, a lot of people will say there's kind of a heaviness in the throat, and they don't know how to overcome that heaviness. The increase in mass by the lesion does increase aperiodicity, right? We've got one vocal fold that's really weighed down, one vocal fold that's not, so we get this aperiodic movement. And sometimes clients can feel that and they just don't know how to overcome it. So with the glottal fry, you're basically inducing a sustained aperiodic voice. So now instead of just one vocal fold that has the lesion on it feeling aperiodic, now you also have the other vocal fold that's lax, wobbly, and now we've got both vocal folds kind of doing this aperiodic voicing. So we can kind of give the feeling in the laryngeal mechanism of kind of this aperiodic voicing happening, which allows us as we slowly move out of it to kind of get used to moving and stretching that polyp. Okay, let's see if we can hear that.
This is Linda Carroll's exercise, vocal fry to modal. This is Linda Carroll. This is Linda Carroll.
Oh my gosh, Linda Carroll, stop. Okay, so we kind of got a feeling there where we were starting in the glottal fry. So you kind of have that glide, and it is almost a little sing-songy, but even your clients who don't want to sing, they can overshoot and do the glide. And again, what we have is that lax vocal fold. As you increase pitch, we engage the cricothyroid, we engage the breath support. That provides regulation over the pitch as we stretch, thin out those vocal folds, and it provides natural adduction, which produces a nice mucosal wave. Now, here's a different set of vocal fry exercises. And again, the whole idea is that we're going to use that register change. Vocal fry, lax, shortened vocal folds into modal, typical stretch of the vocal folds. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create both glottal fry and we're going to create this blowing out high pitch ooh sound. What this is going to do is it's going to force you to have very abrupt jumps between your low glottal fry vowel and a high end modal. Maybe for some clients, they may even overshoot and go into falsetto condition. So the vocal folds are lax and there's no mucosal wave, and then suddenly we're going hopefully just a high modal where the vocal folds are now thinned out, lengthened, and they also are having this adduction pattern that's creating a mucosal wave. So I tried to show this in the video. We'll see how it goes. It's a little bit harder than what it looks.
Happy birthday!
So one of the things that we start to do is first we get our clients to produce the glottal fry, then we get them to kind of figure out how to make that high pitch ooh. And then you spend a lot of the time in this exercise alternating between the glottal fry and the high pitch vowel. And what you want is to be able to decrease the duration in that alteration. So first your client might only be able to go and then they might have to actually pause and stop and take a breath, and then they can flip into that high vowel. What we want to have happen is what you kind of saw in the video, where we're alternating between the glottal fry and the high pitch, and we're doing it with just a few milliseconds in between. And so where there's almost this playful quality as you're able to kind of stretch out your dynamic pitch range. Once the client's able to do that, then you can start to use a glottal fry on different vowels, and then you can change the vowel that you're using in the high pitch. And then eventually you can go from a glottal fry into different phrases. And again, the idea being with the resonant voice. Now you could see for me, I felt like I was using every muscle in my face, including my eyebrows, to try to bring up that high pitch. This was not an easy exercise to do sitting down so you could see me in the camera. I would advise your clients to be standing so that they can get that full breath support. Oh, okay. Now, the hypofunctional dysphonia protocol. This basically uses a non-speech phonatory trigger to facilitate adduction. I want you to be very, 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 very careful if you use this treatment. Because if you look at what some of the phonatory triggers are, we have cough, throat clear, and there's a reason that are asterisks, and hopefully you're thinking to yourself, ooh, those don't sound good. These are habitualized voice patterns that often can cause trauma, right? They can cause phonotrauma. And so those triggers may already be contributing to the voice problem. If that's the case, this may not be the right type of exercise for you. If your client has a habitual cough, and where do we see this happening sometimes? Um, a lot of times our clients who feel like they have a functional voice disorder, they may use a phonatory trigger to aid in their initiation of voicing. So they're already doing this, and they're doing it in such a habitualized way it's actually causing problems. So don't do this exercise with those clients. If you are making progress with those clients, but you still feel like they went from hyperadducting to now they're hypoadducting, right? This can happen. Your clients are overadducting, they're causing phonotrauma. You get them to lighten up and they go from having a strained, strangled voice to now they are super breathy, right? Now you've got the opposite problem. Then if you've got that happening, you might want to bring this protocol in, but I would not use a cough or a throat clear. For that, I would use more of a more speech-like sound, like meow, meow, right? Like the cat call, it's doing the same type of thing. Meow. You've got this like quick adduction pattern to allow for these two vowels to occur, but it's very different than a throat clear, which is very traumatic to the voice. So again, just think about your client. I don't think I would ever use a cough or a throat clear, even though that's what you're going to hear in the example. A gargle is not a bad one, but it's also hard to do without water, as you just heard me try to do it. One of the things that you should also be thinking about is chanting, and some of your semi-occluded techniques are also going to get you to the same place, where you're getting good adduction, but you're also getting the resonance, so we're decreasing tension in the laryngeal mechanism. So those are other possibilities as well. But this one is out in the field, and I do hear people talking about it, so you should be aware of it. Now, one of the first things you got to do is establish your foundation. So again, we don't want tension in the shoulders, we don't want tension in the neck region, we need diaphragmatic breathing. You're going to first have the client initiate that phonatory trigger. Again, I would encourage you to use like the meow, especially if they've already been using chanting or something like that. They're used to, or a chewing technique, they're used to that kind of nasal M sound and that movement of the jaw. You want them to be able to produce that trigger consistently on command, and you want them to be able to do it over an increased duration. So if we're going to use our meow example, we want meow, 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 like over and over and over again. Once they're able to do that, you want to go from the trigger right into the pitch, and you're going to do a pitch glide. Then you're going to produce that glide and then sustain the vowel at mid-range. And so you're going to see as we go from steps 3 to 4, we are basically dropping the phonatory trigger, and then we're going right into resonant voice therapy, right? Where lots of humming, lots of gliding. We've also got some semi-occluded exercises here where we're doing some relaxed sigh and kind of opening up the back of the pharyngeal mechanism. So the hypofunctional dysphonia protocol, it starts off with the phonatory trigger, which is really your adduction, functional adduction exercise, but then it progresses into a resonant voice therapy with some semi-occlusion exercises included. So here's an example of this.
This is the hypofunctional dysphonia protocol contributed by Mark Haxer. This recording will include steps 3 through 9. Step 3, initiate use of a phonatory trigger such as a cough, a throat clear, a gargle, a high-pitched squeak, or a meow. Meow. Step 4. Once voicing can be produced consistently during repetition of the triggers, increase the consistency and duration of the phonation. Step 5. Transition smooth. This is
Okay. So again, just something to think about, like we package that particular exercise and that protocol is packaged as, increasing adduction, but it actually has components of a lot of the other exercises we've talked about. Now, what is this yummy thing that we're looking at? So several of these exercises are targeted specifically at presbyphonia, and they're the ones that I'm going to be talking about after this introduction to this age-related dysphonia. But to really understand why these would work, we need to think about what are the aging effects related to the voice. And so we've talked about women tend to get lower in their pitch, men tend to get higher. Other types of symptoms and signs that are related to dysphonia, there's more pitch breaks. We have oftentimes a breathy vocal quality, and that can happen at either pitch, whether it's increased pitch for men or decreased pitch for women. We do tend to see an increase in laryngeal tension as people try to overcome that breathy vocal quality. We also see abrupt stoppages in phonation, so we get this aphonated pattern every now and then again reduced pitch and loudness. Now we're going to take a look at some of the pictures associated with presbyphonia, and one of the things that happens is that the vocal folds thin with age. Now, what we don't know that's what's happening is that I think it depends on where your baseline is. For women, as we start to see thinning with age, we also tend to see a lot more bowing or drooping of the vocal folds, and so that causes a slight increase in mass from where they were at their baseline fundamental frequency, and so we tend to perceptually hear that as a lowering of the pitch. Now with men, they have a lower fundamental frequency to start with, and that's because they have more tissue and more muscle bulk, right? And generally their laryngeal mechanism is also larger. So when their tissue starts to thin out, it actually decreases the mass, decreases bulk, and now we have a higher pitch occurring with men. So this tissue loss has both an effect on the pitch, but it also, as you can see here, because the vocal folds are so thin, it makes it really difficult to get the vocal folds together. And so we tend to see some bowing and we see some incomplete glottic closure. So that's one problem. Now we can also, you see where these arrows are, when we have thinning of age, when we have thinning of the vocal folds due to age, that tissue loss also means that we can see more of the underlying structures that are connected to those tissues. So these two bilateral bumps may actually, they may look like bilateral vocal nodules, but what you're actually seeing is the arytenoid cartilage. So again, we are losing a lot of tissue if you're able to start seeing that type of structure. And then finally, when we start to see the adduction pattern here, you can see that the vocal folds look concave or almost scalloped in nature, so they're not actually adducting properly. So this is what happens with natural aging. Then if you overlay another vocal disease on top of that or disorder, suddenly we have a lot of problems. But a lot of times people will come and they will report, I don't like how my voice sounds as I age. And so you may be working with older individuals where you're trying to just overcome effects of aging. So here's a few exercises to help you do that. And again, we're really trying to target adducting the vocal folds and increasing that laryngeal adduction. So the sharp onset vowel sentences. What we're trying to do here is we're going to use hard glottal attacks, and we're using them in text loaded with vowels. Now, the idea behind this is if we use hard glottal attacks, but we use them in the context of using vowels, that we naturally adduct for vowels. And so if we start off with a vowel in initial position, we have time to adduct and get those vocal folds together. So when we increase laryngeal adduction, in those contexts, we get used to having the vocal folds already together to build up that pressure. Now, if the client is hyperadducting, right, if they have adduction issues where they have increased tension, do not use this exercise. right? If you're going to use a hard glottal attack, it's got to be with someone who has weakness, aging issues, right, where we're not getting complete glottal closure. The hard glottal attack is really going to emphasize the slamming of those vocal folds together, right? Because you're gonna basically increase the pressure, and you're going to adduct first, let pressure build, and then you're going to start phonating. So if somebody is already over-adducting, this is not the exercise to use with them. How will you know? Your clients with vocal fold paresis or paralysis, your clients with presbyphonia, these are two diagnoses that you know adduction is not happening for one or two vocal folds, right? That's what we know. The client is going to produce a breathy vocal quality. That's going to help you know. Looking at a laryngeal scope, if you see that the vocal folds can come together, that's going to let you know. Someone who has a strained, strangled vocal quality, this is not a good exercise for them. They're already hyperadducting too much. So what we want to monitor is the decrease in the breathy vocal quality over time. And there's lots of ways you can do that, right? We can do it perceptually. We could have the client rate it perceptually. We could objectively look at our noise to harmonics ratio. We could also, as our noise decreases, we might want to flip over and start looking at our harmonics to noise ratio, right? We might want to look at our CPP values for quality. So all of those are just different ways that we could measure this. Now, basically, you're going to do different contexts where you start with different vowels that you use a hard glottal onset with. E, A, I, O, U. Okay? Now, there is going to be breath support there, and I feel like with those examples that I just gave, I used a lot of my breath support, but I also want to think about maybe having my client hyperadduct first, E, A, I, and so here I'm actually, while I'm doing this, I am touching my own larynx, and I can it's just a cue for me to like close here first and not to rely on my diaphragm so much. But here you can get a little bit more idea of somebody else who's doing it.
Sharp onset vowel sentences, contributed by Susan Miller. This recording includes steps 1 through 3. Step 1. Say each of the following vowels with a forceful effort, a sharp onset, at a comfortable pitch. A, E, I, O. Sharp onset vowel sentence. Sharp onset.
Now, going back to that, one of the things you're going to want to think about is that you are basically producing contexts for that client. So you start them off in vowels, then you start them off with words, then you finally move them up into sentences using those same words. So if you say A, then you might have Elaine, then you might have Elaine went down in the evening. Okay, that was a horrible example, but basically you kind of get the idea is that you're stacking your stimuli with these practice vowels that are using the hard glottal onsets, and you're stacking them so that that sound is happening at the beginning. Now this is another example, and it may, your clients may like it better, especially if they're singers, where we're using hard glottal attacks with changes in pitch. This was traditionally used with singers to warm up their voice, and basically what it's doing is it's creating a quick adduction, abduction pattern. So we're working both sets of muscles, your adductors and your PCA, or your posterior cricoarytenoid. So again, good for clients who have breathy vocal qualities due to the fact that they can't get one or both of their vocal folds to midline. This is often due to vocal fold paresis or paralysis or presbyphonia. Okay? Now, one of the things that we also want to think about is if they're able to do it in therapy, home exercises is a big thing in voice therapy because you have people working on something, you want them to habituate that activity, but you don't want them to wait on you if you only see them especially once a week. So with home practice, you also want to make sure you're very, very specific about how often a person should be practicing. This is not the exercise that you say, please do this 8 to 10 times a day, 3 times a day. No, 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 no. That would be too much. That would induce hypertrauma, right? Phonotrauma, hyperadduction. One of those combinations of words work. Hyperadduction, which causes phonotrauma. So, again, be thoughtful. You know, you may have your client do this 1 time a day with 3 trials in a row because, again, you want them to get used to the feeling of adducting, but you don't want to cause trauma.
Up and down staccato, contributed by Susan Miller. This recording includes parts of steps 1 through 3. Step 1. Say each of the following vowels with a forceful effort, a sharp onset, at a comfortable pitch. Oo, E, O. Note whether any vowel feels more comfortable or easy to produce with a sharp onset than the others. Choose one of the vowels and continue to practice attaining a sharp onset on the chosen oo, E, or O sound at a comfortable pitch. Step 2. Practice producing the chosen vowel in a staccato or sharp onset manner while ascending up the scale as an arpeggio. Go up to as high a pitch as you can without straining. E, 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 E.
So again, that might be a really useful exercise for someone who has vocal fold paralysis, who has presbyphonia, but perhaps they've already been doing adduction exercises like the LSVT program. They're able to get their vocal folds to midline okay, but they're not able to do it maybe regularly or on command, so they can get them to midline. This is not the type of exercise, that staccato exercise, and maybe even the one before where you're using the hard glottal attack, for someone who can't even get movement of that paralyzed vocal fold, for someone who has presbycusis but they can't even get the vocal folds to move. You would need to do other type of work to have that happen, right? And that's where maybe we have the hyperadduction exercises, the pushing exercises that we oftentimes see with, say, our Parkinson's patients, okay? So again, think about what necessary baselines have to be in place before you would start an exercise with someone. That staccato exercise is not going to be feasible for someone who doesn't already have some ability to move the vocal folds towards midline. They have to have some sort of ability to adduct already. What you're doing is you're refining that adduction and making it a more habitualized, normal pattern, okay? Now, let's switch gears here completely. The phonation resistance training exercise, or the PHO-RTE, is a very different type of exercise. It looks a lot like sports training, motor learning. This ability that if we use resistance, much like we would do in weight training, that we can increase muscle. And so this was targeted for clients who had presbyphonia with the idea that with that thinning of the vocal folds, that we could, through resistance training, build up that muscle. I feel like, there should be something here. Oh, good. Okay. So one of the things that we want to think about is when we're targeting these 4 exercises, and there's only 4 of them, that we want to be doing it in modal register. So a lot of the different exercises we've talked about for functional adduction is that we've had people down in their glottal fry register, we've had people way up high in their higher pitch, but this is one that's really important that we utilize the vocal folds when they are in their most relaxed state. And that's going to be in the modal register. They're not going to be too stretched. They're not going to be too contracted or shortened. We are trying to target an increased decibel level, sound pressure level. And so the targeted goal is about 20 plus 20 dBSPL above a client's habitual loudness, which means that you have to actually establish what their habitual loudness level is. And you're also going to want to figure out what is their dynamic range when it comes to loudness. How soft can they go? How loud can they go? What is their typical mean loudness level? So you want to get to 20 plus above that level. Now for many clients, that level is 80 to 90 dBSPL, right? If you think about someone who's maybe producing 60 dBSPL in conversational speech, that's a little quieter than typical, right? We typically want 65 dBSPL. Then 20 above 60 would get you to 80. Okay, so we're really increasing loudness. Once you have an idea of what the habitual loudness level is that your client can produce, you start the exercises at 50% of the client's max intensity. So if their dynamic range is, say, 40 dBSPL to 50, let's go up to 60 dBSPL. Start your client at about 30 dBSPL. Okay, that's really, really soft. Okay, and then we're going to build up to that. Maybe you'd say, I'm going to start them at 40, which is their lowest level because they don't have a very big loudness range. So the idea is you know how loud they can be. You have an idea of what their max loudness is, what their minimum loudness is, and you're going to start them off at about 50 or 60% of their max intensity. To be honest, I wouldn't go below minimum intensity levels. If their minimum is already at 30, you don't want to go lower than that, right? So I would say here as kind of a caveat, start the exercises at 50 to 60% of your client's max intensity, unless your client has such a reduced loudness range that takes you below their minimum intensity level, right? In that case, just start at the minimum intensity level and work your way up. The idea is that we are going to do these exercises and that each week you are going to increase the client's target SPL level or decibel level by 5 decibels, okay? So if you start them off at, say, 40 dBSPL, week 2 you're going to go to 45. Week 3 you're going to go to 50 dBSPL. Well, I cannot get any of these letters in the right order. And you're just slowly going to increase the incremental loudness level. So the way that you do this is you're going to have your client first sustain a vowel, and you want them to try to do it. The authors here state loud, energized voice. And what I think that means is that you want really good breath support, and an energized voice means you also want a resonant voice. So again, they're not saying it, but we're inferring to get a nice, long, loud vowel, you need to have really good breath support, but also that energized voice means that you're not doing it with laryngeal tension. Use those resonant features to help your client feel that resonance and move tension out of the laryngeal mechanism, okay? Then you're going to glide. So each exercise, I should say, you're going to have the client perform 8 to 10 times before you move on to the next exercise. You basically want to fatigue in that position. So I'm only going to do it a few times in a row, but you'd go, let's pretend I just held that out for much longer. Then I would do that 7 more times. Or if your client is later in their program, you might push them to do it 10 times. Then you're going to do your glides from low to high and high to low. Again, trying to be very resonant, trying to be very loud, use that breath support. And then you're going to do that 8 to 10 times, okay? Then you want them to shout functional phrases using a loud, high-pitched voice. So here we're shifting from modal register to the high end of our modal register. Not quite into falsetto, but into the very high end of modal register. And this really, I think, could be anything. How are you doing? Now, if we think about what we already know about resonance, and if we think about what we already know about open vocal tracts, right, and that semi-occludedness, where we want the semi-occlusion to kind of be in the front part of the vocal tract and not in the back part where the vocal folds are, you might start, if you were thoughtful about your stimuli, with those that are starting with nasals, with those that have vowels at the beginning, right? Nice, big, open. Those that have glides. Those types of stimuli are forcing an open vocal tract, and it's forcing resonant vibration that the client can feel. Then you can start shifting, once they do that, into stimuli for the third exercise that may not have that type of specific resonant properties. And then the next thing you want to do, instead of having that high-pitched voice in exercise 4, you're going to produce a very strong authoritative voice. Now, what does that mean? A strong authoritative voice, when somebody uses that, they will naturally drop their pitch. So now what we have here are exercises that are focusing functionally at the high end, and then 4th exercise where we have a loud kind of lower voice. Now, you don't want to tell people too low, because then they get really low and suddenly we have glottal fry or something worse. But that authoritative voice, people tend to just naturally go into that low voice. So again, each exercise should be performed 8 to 10 times. Each session should include 2 sets of the exercises with a 1-minute rest between sets. And that's happening twice a day. So at the beginning of your treatment session with your client, at the end of your treatment session with your client, and then they can be working on that at home. Overall, what you want to see is that we get this better vocal quality, less breathy, and then you can start to decrease the number of sets or decrease the number of reps as your client's vocal quality improves. And again, I don't think that there's a hard and fast, like with some of the programs, like that hyperfunctional dysphonic program, they had a very specific set of things you needed to do. In some of the other programs, you had a very specific set of decibel levels you had to hit. With this, you really have to know your client, and you have to be monitoring their quality of their voice quality. So if you're seeing CPP values go up, if you're seeing noise to harmonic ratios go down, you know that you're seeing this generalization, and you can start to slowly back off. Finally, we've got the retention of spaghetti. I feel like it's like a bad song. It's like the return of spaghetti. The retention of spaghetti, again, this idea is that we're going to use breath support, and this is the one exercise for functional adduction that really does use breath support and not just adducting the vocal folds to increase closure. So you want to use this again with clients who have very, very breathy vocal qualities that cannot adduct easily, okay? If you have a client who has vocal bowing, who has paresis, use your typical pushing resistance exercises to help them get that typical adduction. So push down on a chair, push down on a table. Now you know what that feels like. Now I want you just to feel it when you're doing it at the laryngeal level. If you don't have clients with vocal bowing, if you don't have clients with paresis, don't do the pushing, okay? Again, know your client. Why do they have a breathy vocal quality? Is it because they are so swollen and have so much edema from hyperfunction that that's the quality that they have? That's not someone we want to be doing hyperadduction exercises with. Do they have Parkinson's? Is there some reason that there's rigidity? Do they have spastic dysarthria? Do they have a paresis? Do they have presbyphonia? There's something physically keeping those vocal folds from moving to midline, then this is going to work. So the idea is that you're going to use the breath support so that you're sucking in, and you're going to kind of continue sucking in as though you're sipping a long strand of spaghetti. And they do mention in this book that you want to make sure as you're sucking in that you don't start to increase tension. So just even a light finger, that's what digital means. Digitally check, put a finger on the laryngeal mechanism, make sure it's not raising up. You will feel tension in the neck if that's occurring because all those strap muscles are trying to help elevate. Then you want to, when you're at the end of inhalation, adduct your vocal folds. For the client who can do this without pushing down on something, just have them adduct. For your clients who still can't adduct properly, have them push down on something to help with that adduction. Then, once they can do that, once your client feels comfortable sipping in with a spaghetti, that inhale, and then closing the vocal folds, when they actually exhale, you want them to abduct and adduct the vocal folds 10 times in a row. And it's really kind of almost like this kind of hitched breathing. So it's, nope, that's not it at all. Let me just do it. I'm going to sip in. Now, I don't know if you can hear that very well, but it's almost like you're doing diaphragmatic breathing, very quick inhales, very quick exhales, very quick inhales, very quick exhales. In some ways, it's like you're asking your client to hyperventilate, but you want them to be very focused on can they feel the vocal folds adduct, can they feel them abduct, can they feel them adduct, can they feel them abduct, do, 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 do. It's like a song. So if your client is still relying on pushing exercises, don't take them to step 3. They are not going to be able to do that quickly. You have to be able to get them off the pushing exercises on step 2 before you can get them to step 3. The other important thing in here is please pay attention to step 4 and 6. After your client has tried to abduct and adduct multiple times in a row, you need to let them just breathe. And if you need longer than a minute, take longer than a minute. We don't actually want our clients to hyperventilate on us, okay? So this does really give that person control over abduction and adduction. And once they start to recognize the pattern of breathing, that inhale, exhale, and they pair it with the feeling of adduction for inhale, right, and then exhale, abduction, then they're going to get some, it's almost like resonant voice treatment, right? You have this now sensation in your throat that when you need to be louder, when you need to have a better vocal quality, you can call upon that sensation of adducting and then utilize that for better voicing. Okay.